Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Home Studio Deep Dives, the show where we take a look at how to create fantastic sounding audio in and out of your own home. My name is John, I'm a recording engineer, producer, musician, songwriter, trumpet player, and today we're going to be continuing our microphone series with technical specifications. Again, this series is not going to tell you how to build your home studio as easily and as cheaply as possible, but rather give you as much information as possible so that you can make the best decisions for your home studio when looking at websites like Sweetwater and Vintage King. Technical specifications can give you a lot of detailed information about what a microphone is both good and bad at, and this information could be highly useful to you if you're trying to record something specific. In today's video, we'll be covering frequency response, high-pass filters, sound pressure levels, self-noise, signal-to-noise ratio, sensitivity, pads, and finally, impedance. If you're interested in just one of these specifications, you can jump to it with the timestamps. Let's get started. When it comes to frequency response, we can vaguely interpret how a microphone is going to sound. When looking at websites, you'll generally see the frequency response of a microphone listed as something like 20 Hz to 20 kHz. This means that the microphone is capturing all of the frequencies across the spectrum of human hearing, which is also 20 Hz to 20 kHz. Most microphones manufactured today fall within that frequency range. However, it is possible to find microphones that don't extend all the way down to 20 Hz, only making it to 40 or 60 Hz, while others will only go up to 15 kHz. The Royer R10, for example, has a frequency response of 30 Hz to 15 kHz, meaning it's not capturing all the frequencies above 15 kHz as well or as accurately as other microphones that do go up to 20 kHz. This doesn't mean that the Royer is a bad microphone, it's one of my favorite mics that I have. It just means that it has a unique or distinct sound and is extremely useful when capturing sound sources that you don't want to be very bright. The trumpet, for example, sits in the upper frequency range and can sound really bright or harsh with particular types of microphones. The Royer will make the sound much smoother in the upper frequency range and not as harsh and bright. For this reason, ribbons are very commonly used to record brass instruments. Similarly, dynamic microphones like the Shure SM58 are very commonly used for vocals, podcasts, and live performances because they have a limited upper and lower frequency response to help reduce sibilance, low frequency rumbles, and feedback. While the technical specification of 20 Hz to 20 kHz tells us that a microphone is listening to the whole range of human hearing, it's not telling us how well or how poorly it's listening to specific frequencies within that range. For that, we have to look at the frequency response charts or graphs of a microphone. The most typical frequency response graph is showing us the lowest to highest frequencies from left to right in hertz and kilohertz, and also where particular frequencies are accentuated or not picked up as well by the line either going above or below the middle 0 decibel line. If we were to look at the most typical frequency response charts for our 4 different mic types, being the large and small diaphragm condensers, dynamics, and ribbons, we would start to notice some trends. In the first video of this series, I mentioned that large diaphragms can have more character or color to their sound, while small diaphragms sound more natural or accurate. This is because larger diaphragms are not as sensitive to capturing the entire frequency spectrum as small diaphragms. This means a small diaphragm is capturing the sound more accurately across the entire frequency spectrum, and on a frequency chart, this would look like a flatter line as opposed to a large diaphragm, which would have a more curved or accented line. As an example, we can see that the Neumann TLM-103 has a very large boost in the upper frequency range starting at around 5 kHz, while the Beyerdynamic MC930, even though it also has a boost in the upper frequency range, has less of one starting around 9 kHz, with both having a very flat response throughout the middle frequency range. When considering polar patterns, the Omni pattern actually produces a flatter line than a cardioid pattern. We'll get more into this in the next video, but this just means that polar patterns can also affect frequency response. Dynamics and ribbons typically exhibit much larger peaks and dips in their charts as opposed to condenser microphones. Take, for example, the Royer R10, which instead of having a bump has a big roll-off in the upper frequency range, with many little dips and peaks throughout the middle register, and the extremely common Shure SM58, which has a huge boost in the vocal frequency range, only going up to 15 kHz, and also has a huge roll-off starting at around 100 Hz and only going down to 50 Hz. A microphone's frequency response is tested by placing it in a soundproof and non-reflective room called an anechoic chamber, approximately a meter away from a speaker system that is playing pink noise, or noise that contains the entire frequency spectrum. This is a very difficult test to accomplish as it's incredibly expensive and nearly impossible to create a speaker system that has a perfectly flat frequency response. Not only that, different mic manufacturers will use different testing sites with different speaker systems and different anechoic chambers. In other words, the same microphone tested in two different facilities could produce different results on their frequency charts. In addition to this, a lot of microphone companies will introduce smoothing into their charts. This means that instead of representing every slight deviation in the frequency response, they are giving you an overall sense of what the microphone is capturing on the low and high end of the spectrum. This doesn't mean the company is being deceitful in what the microphone is actually capturing, but rather telling you the basic essentials. Other companies will not introduce smoothing and will show the exact frequency response that they tested. Lastly, since none of us are using an anechoic chamber and are consistently always placing our microphones 1 meter away from the sound source to record, the frequency response is going to be inherently different. This is because room acoustics, mic placement, and distance of the microphone can alter the frequencies. Distance, the room you're using, and the sound source you're recording, the construction of the microphone, whether it's condenser, dynamic, or ribbon, the materials used, and the quality of the electronic components all play a giant role in determining the actual sound of the microphone. All of this is to say that frequency response charts and frequency response in general is a useful tool, but it will never really tell you how a microphone is going to sound. A lot of microphones will come with high-pass filters, particularly large and small diaphragm condensers. A high-pass filter is allowing all of the higher frequencies to pass through while lowering or cutting off the lower frequencies. This can help tame some bass-heavy sound sources, potentially reduce low-frequency rumbling noise, or reduce the proximity effect, which is when you place a mic too close to a sound source and the bass increases drastically. There's no standard high-pass filter for microphones, and different microphone companies will have different filters rolling off different amounts at different frequency ranges. The Beyerdynamic has a low-cut filter of 250 Hz at -6 decibels per octave. This means that the slope for the high-pass filter actually starts before 250 Hz, as 250 Hz is at 6 decibels per octave. There are variations in how much that slope happens, but typically this will result in a very gentle roll-off of frequencies above 250 Hz, so that 250 Hz can actually be at -6 decibels per octave. Everything an octave down from 250 Hz will be decreased by 6 decibels. So at 125 Hz, it will be -12 decibels, 62.5 Hz, -18 decibels, so on and so forth. If we change the high-pass filter to be -12 decibels per octave at 250 Hz, this results in a much sharper curve from the high-pass filter. In other words, the slope is less gentle and less high frequencies are cut off above 250 Hz, and the lower frequencies are reduced much more. This can result in a very different sound from the microphone, generally making them sound much brighter, but it can help potentially solve some issues with bass. The Aston Origin also has a low-cut filter starting at 80 Hz, but it doesn't give you the amount of decibel reduction. A lot of companies will only give you the hertz and will not give you the decibel, but you can generally assume that the reduction will be between -6 and -16 decibels per octave. Generally speaking, if you have a low-cut filter that's starting at around 100 Hz or lower, it will typically have a larger decibel reduction. However, if the hertz starts at a higher frequency, like around 250, the decibel reduction will be less, like around -6. SPL stands for sound pressure level, and companies typically include a max SPL number for the technical specifications of microphones. The max SPL of a microphone is referring to how loud a sound source can be until the microphone will start producing distortion in the recorded audio. Sometimes you'll also see a THD number included with the max SPL. THD stands for total harmonic distortion and typically falls within a range of 0.5 to 1%. Mic manufacturers actually determine the max SPL of a microphone when 0.5% or 1% of total harmonic distortion is reached in the overall output of the microphone signal. This number tells you how much distortion is added to the signal output of the microphone once that max SPL number has been reached. Max SPLs are commonly misinterpreted as being the maximum loudness a sound source can be until a microphone is either damaged or destroyed. However, this isn't the case. As you can record even louder sound sources, it will just produce distortion in your recorded audio. For a somewhat real-world example, if you're trying to record a jet taking off and it's producing 160 to 170 dBA, not only will you probably go deaf, but the microphone will probably only record a lot of distortion. This won't necessarily damage the microphone, it's just going to add a lot of distortion to the signal. On gear sites, you'll typically see the max SPL written out as something like this. Max SPL 144 dB. 120 to 150 decibels seems to be a fairly common range for microphones to fall in. This specification is only really important if you're recording a lot of loud sound sources, as most of us commonly don't reach even 120 decibels in our own home studios. However, certain instruments like trumpets, drum sets, and tambourines can actually reach up to 120 to 155 decibels. If you know what you're recording is going to be very loud, then it would probably be best to pick a microphone with a higher SPL. With all active microphones, no matter whether it's a dynamic or ribbon that's been modified to be active or large and small diaphragm condensers, we have to deal with self-noise, also called the equivalent noise level, within the microphone. The electric current being supplied to the microphone and the onboard electronics of active microphones will produce low-level noise, and that noise will be recorded even if no sound source is present. If the self-noise of the microphone is too high, this can potentially ruin your recordings, especially if you're trying to record quiet sound sources or sound sources that are farther away. Self-noise is typically written like 14 decibels A-weighted. Here, things can seem a little tricky when talking about A-weighted measurements. When referring to sound pressure levels, the measurement can either be A-weighted or not. The difference between a dB rating that is not A-weighted and one that is weighted is that the A-weighted measurement is used to simulate human perception of particular frequency ranges. In other words, it's a lot easier for a human to hear the middle frequency ranges as opposed to the extreme upper and lower frequency ranges. This means lower and higher frequencies are perceived as softer to humans, while the middle frequencies, or the frequencies between 1 and 10 kilohertz, are perceived as louder. When talking about self-noise, the measurements are most commonly always A-weighted. While this measurement system is fascinating, it's not really that important. All we really have to know is that active microphones will always have a greater than 0 amount of noise, and the closer that noise is to 0, the less noise we're going to have in our recorded audio. Getting more to the point, the Neumann U87 has a self-noise of 12 decibels, while the Neumann TLM103 has a self-noise of 7 decibels, both of which are very low self-noise numbers. The Aston Origin has a little bit higher self-noise at around 18 decibels. A general rule to follow is anything under 11 decibels is extremely quiet, while 11 to 15 is very good, and 16 to 19 is good enough for general use. Anything going above 20 decibels could start being potentially a little difficult to use. Lastly, passive microphones also technically do have self-noise, but their noise is generated by electrons moving through the coil or ribbon element. It is not easy to hear electrons moving, so they generally aren't included in technical specifications. Self-noise is closely related to the signal-to-noise ratio, or SNR, which is another common technical specification you'll see with microphones. The signal-to-noise ratio specifies a ratio between the reference signal and the noise level within a system, whether that's the signal and noise level from a speaker system, preamp, or even Wi-Fi. In this case, it's the ratio between the wanted signal level and the self-noise of an active microphone. This number is also given to us in decibels. However, this is a ratio as opposed to an actual loudness number, like with sound pressure levels and self-noise. You get the signal-to-noise ratio by subtracting the self-noise from the reference signal, which is always a 94 decibel SPL 1 kHz sine wave. However, instead of writing out 94 decibel 1 kHz sine wave, most technical specifications will just write 1 Pascal. I can't find an incredibly specific reason why we use a 94 decibel 1 kHz sine wave, or the 1 Pascal, but it definitely has something to do with keeping an easy measurement, like 1 Pascal, while also referencing and simulating what's easy for humans to hear, like with the A-weighted measurement. If that makes sense. Getting back to real-world applications, if you have a microphone with a self-noise of 20 dBA, and you subtract that from 94 dB SPL, you get a signal-to-noise ratio of 74 dB SPL. The 74 decibel number is giving you a proportion between the amount of wanted signal and the amount of noise. To keep this as simple as possible, anything under 74 decibels is going to have too much noise in the recorded signal. For example, a microphone with a signal-to-noise ratio of 64 dB SPL is going to have a self-noise of 30 dBA, and that's going to be way too much noise. So a lower self-noise number, when subtracted from the reference signal, or 94 dB SPL, is going to produce a better recording. Active microphones today typically have pretty good self-noise and signal-to-noise ratios, as mic companies are pretty competitive, which is great for us as consumers. However, if you're trying to record quiet sound sources or sound sources that are farther away, this is definitely going to be a technical specification that you want to look at when purchasing an active microphone. Lastly, passive microphones, again, will not typically list this number as their self-noise is negligible. Sensitivity, or open circuit voltage, refers to how much voltage output a microphone has. Essentially, the more sensitive a microphone is, the more tiny details it will hear and amplify on its own. The sensitivity can also help us determine how much gain we could potentially need to bring up the microphone's output voltage to a usable voltage. In the last video, I talked briefly about how active microphones are much more sensitive than passive microphones, and can even be overloaded by loud sound sources and could require the use of a pad, while passive microphones typically require much more gain to bring their output voltage up to a usable voltage. This has quite a few advantages and disadvantages. One of them being that active microphones require much less gain to bring up quieter sound sources and can hear much more detail in things that aren't as loud. This also means that passive microphones will require much more gain to bring that same signal up to a usable level, and more gain in this scenario means more noise in the overall signal. For dynamics and ribbon mics, it could be useful to look at the sensitivity rating, especially if you're not using a great preamp, to make sure that there isn't a lot of noise in your recorded audio from too much gain. You will see the sensitivity measurement for a microphone typically be written out in one of two ways, and sometimes both. Either the measurements will be written as millivolts per Pascal or as decibel volts. Decibel volts and millivolts are not the same kind of measurement as dB, SPL, and dBA. Even though they use the same logarithmic scale, one is an actual perceived loudness, while the other one is a strength in voltages. The perceived loudness and strength in voltages is a thing that I want to get into in a later video in units of measurement for audio stuff, but for now, just know that it's not quite the same thing. Microphones that are lower in their sensitivity or passive will range between 1 to 5 millivolts per Pascal, or -60 to -46 dBV. Active microphones range between 8 to 32 millivolts per Pascal, or -42 to -30 dBV. For both millivolts per Pascal and dBV, the higher the number is, the greater the sensitivity of the microphone, the less gain you need to use to bring it up to a usable level. The sensitivity for this Soyuz is 20 millivolts per Pascal, or -34 dBV, and the sensitivity for this biodynamic is 30 millivolts per Pascal, or -30.5 dBV. In a real-world shootout between the two mics, this translates to the electrical audio signal being a tiny bit louder on the biodynamics than the Soyuz. So the Soyuz required just a tiny amount more gain to reach the same level as the biodynamics. In other words, the actual difference between -34 dBV and -30.5 dBV is actually pretty small, even though those numbers might seem kind of far apart. However, the difference is very noticeable when comparing the Royer R10 to the Beyerdynamic, as the Royer has a sensitivity of 2 millivolts per Pascal or negative 54 dBV. If I'm recording the same sound source with the Beyerdynamic and the Royer, I'm going to need to use a lot more gain for the Royer as opposed to the Beyerdynamic because it is much less sensitive. As a general rule, the sensitivity of passive microphones will be about 20 decibels less than active microphones. In real-world applications, both high-sensitivity active microphones and low-sensitivity passive microphones both have their advantages and disadvantages. For example, dynamic microphones are commonly used for podcasts and live performances because their low sensitivity helps reduce ambient sounds and feedback happening in the environment, especially if the person is speaking very close or directly into the microphone. Conversely, you probably wouldn't want to use a dynamic microphone when recording an orchestra or on a soundstage, as it's not going to pick up all the fine details happening in the environment and will require more gain, as the microphones are most likely going to be placed farther away. Lastly, as I stated earlier, if you're trying to record a loud sound source with an active microphone that has high sensitivity, you could potentially need to use a pad to keep the signal from becoming distorted. In the first video in this series, I briefly touched on how you might need to use a pad to reduce the dBV number of active microphones when recording loud sound sources. PAD stands for Passive Attenuation Device and are only found on active microphones and not passive microphones. Even though a pad is technically a type of resistor and electronic circuitry added to a microphone to reduce the dBV, it's commonly measured in dB/SPL. Here we have a crossover between the voltages and sound pressure levels, as the electrical output of a microphone is directly proportional to the sound pressure levels on the capsule of the microphone. This just means that the louder the sound source is, the more voltage the microphone is outputting. As an example, let's say I'm playing trumpet and producing 140 dBA, and I'm playing into a highly sensitive microphone that has a max SPL of 140 decibels. Even if I don't have any gain added to the microphone's output, it could potentially still be clipping or distorting the audio, even though the microphone has the same SPL as what I'm playing on trumpet. If I activate a negative 20 decibel pad, it would raise the max SPL of the microphone to 160 decibels. Going back to recording the trumpet, if I have the pad activated, this means that the microphone won't be clipping anymore, and I'll actually have to add some gain to bring the output voltage of the microphone up to a usable level. In addition to raising the max SPL of the microphone to 160, it also makes the microphone less sensitive while also increasing the signal-to-noise ratio. For this reason, it's not generally recommended to use pads on normal or quiet sound sources, as it increases the signal-to-noise ratio, which is not a good thing because it adds noise to your signal, while also requiring you to use more gain, which again will also add more noise to your recorded signal. Lastly, the additional circuitry and electronic components used in pads actually produces a perceivable difference in the sound quality of a microphone. For this reason, I really try to limit the use of pads whenever I'm recording even loud sound sources, as I don't typically like the way that they make the mic sound. However, they can be incredibly useful whenever you need to use one. The last specification I would like to briefly discuss is impedance. This spec isn't really as important as the others, but it does deserve to be briefly explained. Microphone impedance refers to the resistance met by the microphone output or the electrical audio signal. In addition to the impedance of the microphone output, the connected preamp or interface also has an impedance rating for the microphone input. So impedance is relevant when determining equipment compatibility. As a general rule, you want the impedance of the microphone to be much lower than the impedance of the input of whatever device it's connected to. For example, if I have a microphone that has an impedance of 150 ohms, I would like the device it's connected to have an impedance of 5 times greater, or about 750 ohms. When the impedance of a microphone is too high or the impedance of an input stage is too low, this results in a kind of a muffled sound, which is coming from a loss in information in its frequency range. The reason why I stated that impedance isn't as important as other specifications in this video is because microphones today are typically manufactured with very low impedance, while most input devices are manufactured with very high impedance. In other words, you're very, very rarely going to run into this issue with modern day gear. The only time impedance becomes more important is when working with ribbon microphones, as instead of having an impedance input stage of at least 5 times greater, you'd rather it be about 10 times greater. Just as an example though, the Royer R10 has an output impedance of 100 ohms, and this Neve 5211 preamp has an input impedance of 9,000 ohms. That's 90 times greater than the output impedance of the Royer. While the Neve 5211 isn't super common for home studios, the Focusrite 2i2 has an input impedance of 3,000 ohms, which is still 30 times greater than the output impedance of the Royer. This means that even with the Focusrite, you're still getting the best frequency response out of the ribbon mic. If you are shopping through microphones and you do happen to see one that has a rating of like 10,000 ohms, I'd highly recommend that you stay away from it. To sum this video up, technical specifications can either be extremely important, such as frequency response, kind of important for specific reasons like self-noise and sensitivity, or not really be that important at all, like impedance. Since all of these technical specifications are really important for microphone manufacturers, this makes it really great for us consumers as microphone brands have become extremely competitive with one another. Since that's the case, most microphones today fall within some of the best ranges for technical specifications. However, it is possible to find an expensive microphone with a bad number here and there. Just because a microphone has a bad technical specification, though, doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad microphone. It could work extremely well in a certain scenario over another microphone. Technical specifications will never tell you how a microphone is going to sound, but they can be a highly valuable resource when trying to record something specific or when looking to buy a new microphone. If you'd like to read a little bit more about technical specifications and what I talked about in this video, or have a reference sheet for buying a new microphone, you can click the link down in the description that will take you to a little article that I make for every video. The article is typically very short, and I try to briefly break down everything into its most basic details so that you can get the most information out of it as possible. In the last and final part of our microphone series, we're going to take a look at polar patterns and microphone applications. As always, if you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe, and if you'd like me to talk about anything in particular, please leave me a comment and I will see what I can do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.